Good day. Today is Monday, 16th December, and yesterday I discussed a speech that the Russian President Vladimir Putin gave to the Congress of the United Russia Party, what you might call the ruling party or the leading party or the party which supports the government in Russia. And I also added a discussion about the speech that the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and the nominal leader of United Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, had also made to this Congress, to the same Congress of the United Russia Party. And I said that it seemed to me as if the rather ambiguous language used by Putin, his references to Novorossiya, without exactly explaining what that means, a resurrection of a term that had been used in 2014 and which harks back to a region or province of the former Tsarist Empire that existed from the late 18th century right up until the Russian Revolution. And certain further comments by Dmitry Medvedev seemed to open up the possibility for further annexations of Ukrainian territory by Russia if the war there continued and if there wasn't a quick agreement to bring the war to an end in the way that Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, appears to want. I also commented in my program yesterday about the extent to which Putin spoke to United Russia about a situation in which Russia is effectively at war. In most of the speeches that Putin has given since the start of the conflict, the fighting in February 2022, he has tended to want to give an impression of life going on as normal, of business as usual. In the speech he gave to the Congress of the United Russia Party, he spoke far more extensively and deeply about the war and its impact on Russian society than he normally does, and he appeared to focus on Russian society's support for the army and of the war, and appeared to want to discuss the war and that support for the army as a consolidation process, leading to a process of consolidation within Russian society. Well, I think we now have something of an explanation about why Putin took this approach in his speech to the meeting of the United Russia Party yesterday. Because today, he and his defense minister, Belousov, Andrei Belousov, have addressed the Defense Ministry Board in Moscow. And they've given their own updates on the state of the war and of the state of the conflict. And though neither of them really talked about it, again, the clear impression that I got was that they were making points in advance of whatever initiative Donald Trump has to try to get negotiations started. And I would simply anticipate that Putin's words were in many respects a continuation of what he said at the Congress of the United Russia Party yesterday. Putin and other Russian officials want to convey to the Americans the fact that Russia is united behind the SMO, that Russian society is fully behind the army. Putin, in his speech yesterday, went out of his way to make the point that all the leading parties in Russia as well as united Russia itself, back the SMO, that the Russians continued to hold the initiative right across the line of contact, that they are continuing to advance. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, Putin and Medvedev together dropped heavy hints to the Americans that given this trajectory of events, in the event that peace was not reached quickly, essentially on Russian terms, future terms from Russia would be harsher still, harsher than the terms that Ukraine and by extension the West could be looking at today. Anyway, in his speech today to the Defense Ministry Board, as I said, Putin took up many of the same themes. Again, he spoke about the extent to which Russian society supports the war, supports the army, has consolidated around the army, and supports the objectives set out in the SMO, the Special Military Operation. He gave more information about the extent to which the war has become an important factor in the Russian economy. Belousov also made comments about this. Both Putin and Belousov said that the war, the upgrade of the armed forces, which of course goes beyond the immediate needs of the war, that all of that taking together is absorbing around 6.3% of Russian GDP. And Belousov also said that it is absorbing around a third of central government revenues. Now, all of that may sound like a great deal, but I can remember that in the early 1980s, around the time when Prime Minister Thatcher was first elected to office in Britain, and during that period, my recollection was that at that time, I may be wrong here, I may be overstating things, but my best recollection was at that time, defence spending, commitments to defence in Britain by the UK also came to around 6% of GDP. Perhaps it was a bit less. Perhaps, as I said, memory is deceiving me on this. But I clearly remember that it was at that time at around 6% of GDP. And certainly in those days, we did not feel in Britain that we were living in a war economy of the sort that some people are talking about. Putin also made the point in an earlier speech, in the speech I believe that he made yesterday, that government spending currently accounts for around 35% of Russian GDP, which, again, may appear a lot, but it is in fact less, significantly less than what one finds in most Western countries, certainly most European countries, and would have been considered unremarkable, again, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in the early 1980s, and was, again, and I'm saying all of this mostly from memory, was about the same proportion of spending, state spending to GDP when Blair and Brown and New Labour were elected to power in Britain in the in 1997. As I said, I'm talking from memory here. If anybody wants to correct these estimates, they're absolutely welcome to. Though I should say I tend to have a good memory for this sort of thing. And going further, I did a few brief checks, and I saw that state debt to GDP ratio in Russia in the first half of this year stood at around 15% of GDP. as opposed to 85% in China, around 100% in the United States, maybe more than that actually now in the United States, and of course in Britain and France and Italy. It is higher, much higher than 100%. In Germany, it is still less than 100%, but around 65%. State debt being around 65% of GDP in Germany, it is still a lot higher than in Russia. My simple point is that these are figures, these are numbers, which though they may seem high, are certainly sustainable by any economy as large and as diversified and as resource rich as the Russian. For, well, one might be tempted to say the indefinite future. That's not to say that this doesn't create strains. It clearly does. And it's not to say that spending perhaps would be better invested in other things like upgrading healthcare and education. But my point is that anyone who assumes or expects that Russia is going to be exhausted by some kind of ongoing arms race, that it's not going to be able to sustain the war for more than a year or 2 years or 3 or 5, based on these figures, is going to be disappointed. This is, economically speaking, from a Russian point of view, a sustainable war. And given the importance that the Russians attach to it, given the importance that Putin and the government attaches to it, I think it would be a dangerous illusion to think otherwise. Anyway, let's put all that aside and let's focus instead on what Putin and Belousov said. And Belousov, in some ways, had the more interesting things to say. But suffice to say that my overall impression of Putin's statements, again, is that he was taking a very tough line. One of the things that he said, and he said that not in his first address, but in a second address that he also made at the same meeting of the Defense Ministry Board, basically wrapping up what had been said at that meeting. He said that the current government of Ukraine is illegitimate. He again set himself up as an expert on Ukraine's constitution and constitutional law. He said that the constitution in Ukraine does not permit the extension of the president's term, simply because martial law has been decreed. It extends the term of the parliament, but that doesn't mean that the president's term is extended also. Well, that's Putin's opinion. I'm reluctant myself to engage in this kind of discussion. I'm not an expert on Ukrainian constitutional law. That is something that I think ought to be left to the Ukrainians. Maybe Putin has heard this criticism because he went out of his way to try to answer it this time. He said that not only does he believe these things, but he further appears to believe these things because the only bodies in Ukraine that are supposedly capable of adjudicating on this question, whether the extension of the president's term by martial law is legal or not, is constitutional or not. Ukraine's constitutional and supreme courts are not in a position to do so. He made the extraordinary claim, which may be true, I'm not saying it isn't, just that I'd not heard of it before, that the president of the Supreme Court in Ukraine is in prison, And he also made the further claim that the president of the Constitutional Court has fled abroad, where he is supposedly under the protection of whichever government it is that whose country he has fled to because of potential threats to his person. I want to stress again, I'm not saying that what Putin says here is true, though I would be surprised if Putin has just invented these things out of the air. I've not heard these things before, but anyway, the key point, the key takeaway from all of these words is that Putin again stressed that as far as he is concerned, the current Ukrainian government is illegitimate. And of course, when he meets the Ukrainian government, he obviously refers first and foremost to President Zelensky. So he is again casting doubt on the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government. He is casting doubt on the legitimacy, he cast doubt in this speech on the legitimacy of the entire constitutional and legal structure in Ukraine. He said that it came to power as a result of a coup d'etat in February 2014, the one which overthrew the democratically elected and constitutionally elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and that everything that has happened in Ukraine has its origins in that coup, and that in light of the lawless nature in which the current political structure in Ukraine was created, nothing can be expected of it. On this issue, by the way, I should make it clear that I tend to agree with Putin. I too think that the seizure of power in February 2014 was flagrantly unconstitutional and violent, and I think it did mark a massive change in political direction by Ukraine. And like Putin, I also think that it has led directly to the point we are in today and to everything else that has happened since those events in February 2014 took place. But anyway, Putin talked a lot about that. He also had much to say about the devastation and disaster that Ukraine currently finds itself in. He spoke about the total number of casualties in Ukraine being somewhere around 1 million, and his defense minister, Andrei Belousov, said much the same. We'll come to that shortly. And anyway, my overall sense, my strong feeling here is that though he is not ruling out negotiations with the Ukrainians, he has no real confidence or expectation that those negotiations will lead to anything positive. So, and he made no attempt, as far as I could see, to conceal his deep sense of disgust with the entire system in Ukraine that exists at the moment. He also incidentally spoke about his belief that Ukraine will indeed reduce the mobilization age to 18. He said that they're being pressured to do that by, as he put it, their Western controllers, in other words, the United States and its friends. He appears to think it is only a matter of time before Ukraine goes along with that. He talked about boys being sent to the slaughter. On this, again, I have to say I completely agree with him. I am in full agreement with him on this. And he also said that one way or the other, it is not going to change the trajectory of the war. And about that, I agree with him again. I don't see any reason to think that sending boys of 18 and 19 and 20 to fight presumably with inadequate training, at this stage in the war, is going to in any way affect or change the outcome or slow the development of events to any significant degree. And he also spoke, and this takes us back to his earlier points about the overwhelming support that there is across Russian society. He also spoke about the growing size of the Russian armed forces. He said that 1,000 men are signing contracts to join the military every day. This has been an ongoing process since the start of 2023, and it continues. Now, as to that, Mediazona, which provides a detailed track of Russian casualty numbers, has recently suggested that since the middle of the year, the number of men who have been joining the Russian military has started to tail off. This has been based on budget numbers that have been published by the Russian authorities. They have been looking at the amount of the aggregate amount of the bonuses that are paid to men who agreed to sign up for the Russian military. And they say that this suggests that basically since midsummer, the number has very significantly tailed off. And they're suggesting that the number of men who are enlisting in the Russian armed forces has now fallen to around 13,000 a month, far below the 1,000 a day, 30,000 plus a month that Putin is talking about. However, Mediazona did concede that this could simply be a case of statistics, that it might be that the Russian government has not yet sorted out its budgetary figures, that the correct amount that's being spent on new recruits will only be published when the final budget figures are given at the end of the year. Mediazona concedes that this is a common practice in Russia. I have to say that that's absolutely my own experience. I mean, looking at Russian budget statistics, well, for a very substantial part of my adult life, I can even remember doing it occasionally in Soviet times. And it's absolutely standard for the Russians to tot up their budget statistics to provide a final budgetary number after the end of the year, when all the spending has been counted up and aggregated. And it might be unwise to make assumptions about budget numbers. In fact, it is unwise to make too many assumptions about budget numbers as they're being calculated in the weeks immediately prior to the new year and Christmas holidays. Having said that, as I said, we will only know in a couple of weeks' time. But for the record, I personally think it is unlikely that both Putin and Belousov would be telling the Defense Ministry Board that the Russians are enlisting 1,000 men a day if that were entirely untrue. It's the sort of fake that the men who were listening to the speech would, of course, immediately know about. You could argue that this is intended to deceive the West and the Ukrainians and to put up a brave front in advance of the negotiations. But again, I have to say, I think on balance that it wouldn't be necessary for Putin and Belousov to bring up this topic at all if numbers really were falling and they wanted to conceal the fact. I would have thought that preserving silence about the matter would be much more in character rather than straightforwardly lying about it. So I'm inclined to think that what Putin and Belousov are saying is true, and that indeed we are looking at a further increase, a continuing increase in the size of the Russian military. In fact, if I can go to what Belousov himself said, he said, to this end, systematic work to satisfy the needs of the armed forces continues with the help of the regions. This year alone, over 427,000 servicemen have already been enlisted. On average, more than 1,200 people daily sign contracts to serve in the armed forces. It is important not to lose the momentum of this process. I think I'm right in saying that if you follow Belousov's numbers, the number of people who have joined the Russian army this year substantially exceeds the total number of people who joined the Russian army in the previous year, 2023. So the size of the Russian army, according to both Belousov and Putin, continues to grow. And perhaps just to say again, obviously a lot of this is focused on the special military operation, on winning the war against Ukraine, but the increase in size of the Russian armed forces is not a temporary thing. Putin spoke at length about the growing military presence of the United States in Europe, the hostility of the Western powers, the extent to which the United States and NATO are extending their military footprint around the world, even as they remain hostile to Russia. So it looks as if the Russians have made a long-term decision to upgrade and increase the size of their armed forces. And as I said, based on the economic numbers, they can afford it. They can afford it and continue to do so for a very long time. But what about the war? Well, all of those points about the illegitimacy of the Ukrainian government, taken together with the comments that were made yesterday by Putin and Medvedev at the meeting of the United Russia Party, all of that tells us that the Russians, in advance of the meeting with Donald Trump, or rather the meeting with Donald Trump's officials, the negotiations that Donald Trump is talking about, intend to take a very hard line. I know that there are some who still think that the Russians will be very quick, are very anxious and quick to achieve peace. Maybe they are, but publicly their words are telling us a completely different story. And the one thing I would say is that though Putin himself took a strong line about the West, about the hostility that Russia faces from the West, he was careful, or at least he seemed to me to be careful not to burn his bridges with Trump and with the incoming administration. Take this paragraph. We see that the current US administration, practically the entire collective West, do not abandon their efforts to maintain global dominance, continue to impose their so-called rules on the world community, which they change time after time, distorting them in a way that is convenient for them. Note the words the current US administration. Putin could have just said the United States, but he did not do so. He focused on the current US administration, which is to say the Biden administration. He does seem to be willing to leave it open for some kind of dialogue to be established with a new administration, the Trump administration, which will shortly take power in the United States. So anyway, that's the generality of the things. But let's go to what Belousov said. Belousov again talked about the enormous increase in Russian weapons production, 7 times more tanks, new and modernized, being produced in Russia than was the case in 2022, 3 times more armored vehicles, 35 times more drones. The difficulty in understanding these numbers is that the Russians never give us the base figures. So I, for example, do not know exactly how many armored vehicles the Russians were producing in early 2022 before the special military operation began. So without that base number, simply saying that they are producing 3 times more is difficult for me to assess. Of course, various figures have been published in the West, but I've gradually come round to the view that most of those numbers are very unreliable, both about pre-war Russian production of military equipment and, of course, about production of Russian military equipment today. But Belousov did say that the Russian military industries are producing weapons in sufficient quantity to meet the army's needs, at least the needs of the army fighting in the war. And he did speak a lot about the fact that there needed to be much more work done to keep weapons development up to date, to anticipate new directions in weaponry and that kind of thing. But if we speak specifically about the war, he accepted that from time to time problems exist. He spoke at length about how these should be addressed. But he did seem to feel overall that the Russians are producing enough of what they need in order to go on winning. And given that the army is growing in size by at the rate of 430,000 a year, according to Putin, well, that in itself, if production needs are being satisfied, must mean that there has been a considerable upgrade in production altogether, even though, as I've said already, I'm not in a position to give any exact number, and I think I've come to the view that it's perhaps unwise to try to do so. Anyway, Belousov also spoke about, I think it was 4,500 square kilometers of territory that the Russians have captured over the course of this year. Again, that perhaps actually is not as huge a number as one might suppose, but having said that, the fact that there have been very substantial Russian advances, no one disputes, though in my opinion, the true metric of these advances is not to be measured in square kilometers. It is in strategic positions, in the defense positions of the Ukrainian military that the Russians have been breaking through. And I think it is increasingly clear now that the Russians are finally, especially in the Pokrovsk area, coming to the end of the great defense lines that the Ukrainians created in Donbass after the fighting in 2014, 2015 had ended. going back to that program that Daniel Davis Deep Dive, did a couple of days ago, it seems that there are no great fortified positions west of Pokrovsk, stretching all the way to the Dnieper itself. And it seems also that most of the fortified positions, the fortifications that were created by the Ukrainians, that the Russians have broken through or are breaking through, most of them, not all of them, were created before the fighting in 2022 began, in February 2022 began. Now, if that is correct, by the way, if the Ukrainians were already establishing fortified positions around places like Kurachovo and Pokrovsk before February 2022, that must mean that they were anticipating at some point a war with the Russian army. Because I cannot believe that they would ever have seriously expected that the Ukrainian militia, the Donbass militia, would ever break through and reach as far west as Pokrovsk. Just saying. But anyway, large areas of territory have been captured, and Belousov gives appalling numbers for Ukrainian casualties. He speaks of the Ukrainians having suffered around 500,000 casualties, that's dead and wounded, this year, the largest total by far at any point during the war, much higher than in 2022 or 2023. And we're told that Ukraine has suffered around 1 million casualties overall. It is important, again, just to repeat, that this is wounded as well as dead. I'm not going to try to work out what proportion of these 1 million casualties Belousov thinks are dead as opposed to wounded. I've seen a ballpark number suggesting that for every man who's killed in battle, around 9 are seriously injured, which would put a number of around 100,000 Ukrainian dead. Perhaps the true number is significantly higher than this. I get the sense that in this war, the ratio of dead to wounded is different. But again, I'm not going to make any actual judgments about this. The fact that Ukraine is now desperately short of manpower, that the army is being worn down and is becoming increasingly exhausted, that it's suffering repeatedly from desertions. Supposedly, around 1,000 Ukrainian troops deserted en masse near the village of Shevchenko, close to Pokrovsk, just a few days ago, thereby allowing the Russians to make significant advances close to that village. Again, that's something I can't corroborate, and I've not seen any mention of that by the Russian Defense Ministry, for example. So it may be true or it may not be true. But anyway, that there has been an increase in desertions is now universally accepted. That the Ukrainian army is short of men is universally accepted also. That the mobilization, the extra mobilization that Zelensky announced in April has failed, that he has failed to produce the numbers of additional recruits that had been anticipated. That, I think, is also generally acknowledged. Around this time last year, I remember that the then still overall commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Zaluzhny, was talking about Ukraine needing around 500,000 men to fill out the gaps in the army. it's clear that only a fraction of that number has been produced as a result of the mobilizations, and it's clear that those gaps have since then significantly increased. So overall, the picture that Belousov is providing is of a much bigger Russian army, certainly than the one which existed in 2022, of a much better equipped Russian army than the one which existed in 2022. Both Putin and Belousov spoke about a much better and more experienced Russian army that had existed in 2022. Both of them spoke about the need to retain the experienced soldiers and NCOs and junior officers that have learnt so much over the course of the fighting, to build the army basically around them and to assimilate and learn all the lessons of the conflict. So both Putin and Belousov are in effect giving us reason to think that the military is in much better condition overall than it was when the war started. And by contrast, according to Belousov, a Ukrainian army that is now suffering record losses, and which all of the other reports that we're getting from various parts of the battlefronts, and indeed from Ukrainian commentators themselves, says is finding it extremely difficult to hold on to their various positions. So let's now talk about what is actually going on the battlefronts. Again, I'm going to give a broad brush summary rather than a very detailed account. I'm going to say right away that it's becoming increasingly clear to me that Ukrainian commentators and who talk about successful counterattacks, or have been talking about successful counterattacks at various points on the battlefronts over the last couple of days, have been infected to a certain degree at least by wishful thinking. I don't want to suggest that these people are outright lying. My own impression of many of the Ukrainian commentators, people like Belousov, for example, who, by the way, has been contradicting some of the claims of successes that some other Ukrainian reporters have made. My impression is that they have made a serious effort to report the war honestly, even if they often make mistakes and get things wrong. But anyway, they don't want to face up, understandably enough, to the increasingly catastrophic reality. Being deeply patriotic and loyal to Ukraine and hostile to Russia, they still want to believe that things are all right, or that they can be turned round. Belousov in particular, a little like Bezuglaya, has become an increasingly vocal critic of the Ukrainian command, suggesting that really what needs to happen in order to turn the situation round is to basically replace all the current crop of incompetent commanders with supposedly competent commanders, though it's not clear where these more competent commanders would come from or how they would actually change the situation. But anyway, putting all that aside, every so often we get reports about successful Ukrainian counterattacks, and then a couple of days later further reports trickle through, and those claims about successful Ukrainian counterattacks are quickly contradicted. So if we start from the south, Velikaya Novosilka, there were reports about a week ago that the Ukrainians had sent another mechanized brigade to Velikaya Novosilka, that this had successfully stabilized the situation in this small town, except, of course, that it's turned out otherwise. It turns out that the Russians not only are entrenched in Novi Komar, the village to the north of Velikaya Novosilka, but that they have significantly reinforced there. That means that access to Velikaya Novosilka from the north has essentially stopped, that Velikaya Novosilka is now cut off from the north. There were various claims that the Ukrainians had recaptured the village of Rozdolnovka to the northwest of Velikaya Novosilka. Doesn't seem, after all, as if that was true. There are reports today that the Russians have successfully encircled Mercouris, which lies to the south of Velikaya Novosilka. The Russians already control Blagodatnoye, which lies immediately to the north, and it looks as if the Russians are now close to reaching the village of Niskuchnie, which lies immediately to the southwest of Velikaya Novosilka, and they're also close to cutting the main road from Velikaya Novosilka through its suburb known as Vremovka. They're close to cutting off the main road that goes west to Gulyapolye. So it looks as if Velikaya Novosilka is about to be encircled. That the Russians have been slowly tightening the ring around this small settlement for about a month, maybe 6 weeks. The ring has now almost closed. It's unknown how many Ukrainian troops are still in this small town. The town itself, the Russians apparently control around 10% of the town in the southeastern section of the town. There's pictures that the Russians are conducting drone attacks on the Ukrainian troops in the northern boundaries, the northern outskirts of this small town. Apparently the town was heavily fortified. There are various small rivers that crisscross it, which could form defensive barriers. It might be a tough battle, but with the Ukrainian troops in the town cut off from resupply, and having apparently received strict orders from Syrskyi and Zelensky that they must under no circumstances retreat or think of retreating until Trump has been inaugurated president, or even beyond that date. Well, it looks like the Ukrainian troops, the fate of the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka has been sealed, as it was in Ugleda and in all sorts of other places as well. And if we go to the other town nearby, which is Kurakhovo, I say nearby, it's not actually quite that close. The Russians are now saying that they control 90% of the residential area of Kurakhovo. Drone footage of the town has now appeared, and interestingly, it shows the town almost completely undamaged. It looks as if the Russians have advanced through the town from the eastern end right through to the western end. It's a sort of very flat, narrow, rectangular place on the south of the Kurakhovo area, but it's clear that there's not actually been intense fighting in Kurakhovo itself. The major battles have been fought to the south of Kurakhovo in the various villages, And to the north of Kurakovo, on the Kurakovo north of the Kurakovo Reservoir, capturing places like Vovchenka, Ilinka, Beretsky, Stary Terny, a village called Shevchenko to the west of Stary Terny. And apparently the Russians have now actually reached Dachnia itself, immediately to the west of Kurakovo. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians just able to advance through Kurakovo without encountering a great deal of resistance. There is apparently a power station, a thermal power station, located to the west of Kurakovo. It seems that most of the Ukrainian troops who were defending Kurakovo have retreated to the territory of the thermal power station. It's unlikely they will stay there for very long, because if they do, if the Russians have indeed reached Dachnia, then they will be surrounded. And I'm going to make a guess that despite whatever instructions they've received from Zelensky and Syrskyi, they will decide to leave of their own volition anyway. Just to say. So, I think the Battle of Kurakovo is to all intents and purposes finished. The Russians control all of the important villages to the south. The Uspenivka fortified area, some people call it, has collapsed. The Russians control places like the villages of Ganivka, Yelizavetivka, Konstantinopolsk, it seems. There's reports that they've now entered the village of Zelenivka, which lies immediately to the north of the village of Sukhiyali that the Russians captured about a week ago. That brings the Russians very close to another cluster of villages, or Lakli, Andreevka, or Rozliv, Constantinople, which some people are claiming is the last big fortified position that the Ukrainians have in this area, east of the Dnieper River. Who knows? But anyway, I would guess myself that with Velikaya Novosilka likely to fall fairly soon, with the Russians about to capture Kurakovo itself, it's going to be extremely difficult, to put it mildly, for the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves in this cluster of villages for very long, even if they have indeed established fortified positions there. Now, there's also been lots of reports from Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians claimed, as I said at various times, they've recaptured Novy Komar, but it looks as if that wasn't true. The Ukrainians claimed at one point that they mounted a successful counterattack and pushed the Russians back in the villages south of Kurakovo. Doesn't look as if that was true either. There have been reports that the Ukrainians conducted counterattacks that successfully pushed the Russians back in two of the villages southwest of Pokrovsk, Shevchenko and Novotroitsky. However, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, has been speaking today about Shevchenko being completely, entirely under Russian control. Of course, he may be wrong. He's not always been completely reliable about these sort of things, just to say. But it's highly likely, it seems to me, that the Russians do control Shevchenko and Novotroitsky, and it looks as if they're now busy capturing more villages somewhat to the southwest of Pokrovsk, southeast rather, of Pokrovsk itself. They're edging closer to Pokrovsk all of the time, and it's likely that before long an attack on Pokrovsk will take place. For the record, I suspect what has happened is that General Tarnavsky, the new commander of the Ukrainian forces defending Pokrovsk, appointed to that post by General Syrsky and by Zelensky, was given instructions to defend Pokrovsk and was told to push the Russians back. General Tarnavsky is one of these generals who always carries out these sort of orders, illogical though they often are. Probably he did launch some kind of a counterattack towards Shevchenko and Novotroitsky. It may indeed, for a short time, have recovered some ground, but probably at the cost of heavy losses. And I suspect that those gains have by now probably already been reversed, allowing the Russians to conduct further advances. That's my guess. Anyway, going further, there's now confirmation that the Russians control the whole of the area of the central mine in Toretsk. They appear to have enlarged the territory that they control in Toretsk. From what I can see, only some of the outer suburbs of Toretsk remain to be captured. I'm going to make a guess that Toretsk, the Battle of Toretsk, by the start of the new year will have ended. The Russians will be in complete control of Toretsk. There's all sorts of claims about a successful Ukrainian counterattack in the industrial area of Chasiv Yar. Maybe there has such a counterattack. It would be a desperate step if it had happened. Again, one that would have led to the loss of many more lives. I remember how some weeks ago the Ukrainians conducted what was represented as a successful counterattack in Volchansk, recapturing the aggregate plant there. About a few days later, after heavily shelling and bombing, the Ukrainian troops could reoccupy the ruins of the aggregate plant. Group of forces north said that they had regained control of it. I'm going to guess the same is going to happen in Chasiv Yar if these reports turn out even to be true. And along the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk, the Russians are steadily enlarging the bridgehead that they've established on the western bank of the Oskol River, looking like they're preparing to mount an assault on Kupiansk from the west and perhaps encircle this town. It's a strange and complicated battle that's been fought along the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. The Russians don't seem to have given a huge amount of priority to this part of the battlefronts. Maybe reinforcements that would have been sent to the Oskol and Zherebets rivers and to the area around Siversk was diverted instead to dealing with the Ukrainian troops in Kursk. Who's to say? But anyway, one way or the other, the Russians are gradually tightening their grip around Kupiansk, and it's now universally acknowledged that the brief Russian foray into Kupiansk itself that attracted a lot of attention a couple of weeks ago was a ruse. It was intended to compel the Ukrainians to redeploy troops from the west to the east bank of the Oskol River, making it possible for the Russians to establish the bridgehead that they did. And meanwhile, the Russians continue to shrink the Kursk pocket. there's now again a battle for that endlessly fought over village of Malaya Loknia. A group of forces north continues to claim major advances. The Ukrainians continue to claim that these advances are the product of advances attacks by the North Korean soldiers. The evidence that the soldiers in question are North Koreans are provided by long distance footage taken by Ukrainian drones that show soldiers, either North Korean or Russian, advancing towards Ukrainian positions across the landscape. I don't think it is remotely possible, in any way possible, to judge whether these soldiers are Russians or North Koreans. And I personally see no reason to assume that they are not Russians. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say about the fighting in Kursk. The Kursk pocket is being reduced in size all the time. I think it's now between a third and 40% of the maximum size it achieved at the end of August, with, as I've discussed previously, a real risk that the Ukrainian troops in Kursk might find themselves cut off and surrounded there. So, the situation on the battlefronts continues to move in the Russians' favour. Once the Russians have rolled up Velikaya Novosilka and Kurakovo, their forces will be released to conduct the last assault on the one big remaining Ukrainian position in this part of the battlefronts, which is Pokrovsk itself, at which point the Russians have the option, if they choose to take it, to advance west towards the river, towards the Dnieper, with the catastrophic consequences for the Ukrainians that would arise if in this area of Ukraine they were to reach it. What the Russians' plans are, of course, I do not know. Just to say. Meanwhile, the Western powers continue to be divided. I think it is now quite clear that Donald Trump wants to bring America's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And in fact, there's an article in the New York Times today which says that in the opinion of the author, and it is only as far as I can see an opinion piece, Trump does not even want to give Ukraine an American security guarantee. It's not just non-membership of NATO. He doesn't want to extend any sort of guarantee from the United States to Ukraine at all. And his priority, apparently, is to stop this bleed of American supplies and equipment to Ukraine, to focus instead on confronting China. China has conducted another massive exercise around Taiwan, highlighting the challenge that the United States perceives that it faces in China. And Donald Trump feels that the priority is to deal with that, not continue to be bogged down in Ukraine itself. Now, I'm going to make one general observation about any negotiations. I've said in previous programs that the major leverage that the United States, the Trump administration, has over the Russians in any future negotiation is the Russian desire, perhaps need is not too strong, to see a negotiated solution to the question of security on their western borders, on the Russians' western borders, so that the Russians can then focus on economic development of their own country, which remains their long-term priority. The Russians have always made it clear that that is what they're seeking, and for that reason, they want a settlement, a permanent settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, which is ultimately a conflict between Russia and the collective West. And in order to achieve that kind of settlement, that might persuade them that it is very much in their interests not to occupy the entirety of Ukraine. It is a point, by the way, that Eve Smith has made many times in Naked Capitalism. It's not exactly the same point. She does make various valid and additional points also. But I would simplify it by saying that that is the kernel of the issue from the Russian point of view. And I think that is right. I think Putin, the Russian Security Council, what they want is security on their western borders. If they can get a satisfactory deal with the Americans that can provide that, then arguably they would be strongly tempted to go for it, even as they wanted cast iron guarantees that it would stick, which powerful Russian military, they would say, is probably ultimately the only long-term guarantee. So that's the Russian side. But in any such negotiation, you could equally well argue that the Russians have a certain degree of leverage over the Americans also. Because a couple of months ago, I remember reading a long piece published by the Institute of the Study of War in Washington, and they were talking about the need for the United States to achieve a military victory by Ukraine, in Ukraine, because otherwise the United States could find itself permanently tied down, facing off against a hostile Russia with powerful armed forces in control of Ukrainian territory, able to bring enormous pressure to bear on American allies in the Baltic and in Central Europe. So I obviously don't agree at all with the entire geopolitical perspective of the Institute of the Study of War. I would say that if we do arrive at the kind of outcome they warned against, well, it's largely because of policies, in fact, it's entirely because of policies, that they and people like them advocated. There were any number of opportunities to resolve the Ukrainian crisis peacefully without bringing us to the point that they're talking about. But all right, put all that aside, you could see that there is some force in this argument. I don't think that the United States should be working to confront the Chinese militarily. I think that just as the Russians would be keen for some kind of détente in Europe, I think China would be equally keen to see some kind of détente with the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that would cover also the question of Taiwan. I think the Chinese understand that a military operation to capture Taiwan would be fraught with risk, and I think they would prefer not to have to do it, though they will do it if the US crosses their red lines and supports secession by Taiwan. Just saying. So I think that's my own view. I think that the United States, instead of seeking confrontation, should look for peace with both of these two powerful countries, Russia and China as well. Or if not peace, what I have previously described as a wider geopolitical ceasefire, a kind of return to détente. But anyway, again, put all that aside. If your priority as the United States is to confront China in the Indo-Pacific, if you feel that there is some kind of great threat to your power because of the growth of Chinese power, if you believe that the development of the Chinese military is so alarming that you have to transfer most of your military from Europe to the Pacific, then of course you need a deal with the Russians. Because to go back to what the Institute for the Study of War was saying, you can't be strong in both places at once. You can't keep vast parts of your air force locked in one place in Europe and at the same time confront China with equal force in the Pacific. The United States in the 1960s was powerful enough relative to the Soviet Union and to Mao's China to be able to do that. Today's United States, up against the immeasurably more powerful countries that today's China and arguably even today's Russia are, at least in aggregate, cannot. So, if the Americans have leverage over the Russians, in that the Russians want peace on their western border so that they can prioritize their own urgent needs, domestic needs, it's important to say that the Russians, who are of course very aware of these American concerns about China, also have leverage over the United States in the sense that the further west in Ukraine they go, the deeper the strategic dilemma for the US, the overextensions crisis that the US faces, the deeper it goes. So this is going to be a complex, very difficult negotiation, a very intricate poker game. But one can see that both the Americans and the Russians nonetheless do have a common interest, each for their own straightforward national interests in trying to bring this war to an end. However, the same cannot be said for their European allies. Gordon Hahn and Stephen Bryan at Asia Times have both discussed Zelensky's statements and policies. And they both say, what I think is true, that the Zelensky government, that Zelensky himself, show no interest or ability to negotiate peace for Ukraine, even as everything starts to collapse around them. The problems of doing that, psychologically and politically and ideologically, are simply too great. Zelensky himself probably feels that he's burnt his bridges with Putin and with the Russians, and Putin's words today at the Defense Ministry Board, casting doubt on his legitimacy, would appear to confirm his concerns. The other parts of the Ukrainian political military intelligence system probably feel the same way. After all, we're talking about people who've conducted a campaign of assassination inside Russia itself. Whatever they may think about the tough-minded, pragmatic attitudes that the Russians have, they must still worry about facing potential consequences if a peace is made which leaves Russia in a position of ascendancy over Ukraine. And of course that concern will be trebly felt by the various men of the various nationalist brigades, by large sections of the security and intelligence apparatus that exists in Ukraine. It's difficult to really believe that these people are ultimately going to welcome peace. The trouble is that they're likely to find allies in the United States itself, but also in Europe. Now, I have been following very closely the various comments and statements made by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Before the war, he set himself up as a voice of moderation, as somebody who wanted to avoid a war between Ukraine and Russia, who was prepared to make significant concessions to the Russians in order to prevent that happening, though those concessions were never clearly spelled out, and the Russians eventually concluded that he was all mouth and nothing more. Anyway, Macron, over the course of this year, has emerged as the West's most belligerent hardliner. And he's been talking again about sending troops to Ukraine, 40,000-man peace mission. He's failed in his attempts to get the Poles to agree to that. Friedrich Merz in Germany seems to have rejected the idea outright. But I have to say, listening to Macron, listening to what he has to say, again, I don't think that Macron currently is somebody who genuinely wants to see a peace achieved in Ukraine. I suspect the same is true, to a great extent, of the Starmer government in London and of the political class in Britain. If the Americans and the Russians come to a deal, they will not openly oppose it, but they will be deeply unhappy, and they would not be sorry if whatever agreement was reached fell apart, and more likely than not, they will be quietly urging the Ukrainians to hold out and perhaps try to continue the war and to find some means to sabotage the whole process. It is going to require extremely tough diplomacy from Donald Trump's officials and from Trump himself to try to seal the deal, given the level of opposition that exists. And with the Russians currently in the mood that they're in, I'm not sure that that is going to happen. Anyway, I say all of this. Negotiations of some kind will begin in January. I'm not sure where they're going to lead to, but I'm going to make one prediction. As those negotiations start to get underway, what we're probably going to see is that under the cover of the negotiations, the Americans will begin a drawdown of their own commitment from Ukraine. This is not because there's been any shift in opinion about Russia in the United States. I get the sense that Trump himself doesn't have the entrenched hostility to Russia that so many people in the United States do. Douglas McGregor, who knows Trump, has said as much. But I don't think the new administration is any more pro-Russian than the current administration is, just to say. But I think that the Trump people have made their calculations, just as the Pentagon made its calculations about Vietnam back in the 60s and early 70s. And they have jointly concluded that it is no longer in the US interest to continue to invest so heavily in Ukraine. So, quite plausibly, we will see some sort of discussions and negotiations take place. The negotiations will be protracted and complicated. They might not result in any quick outcome. But over the course of them, we will gradually see American aid to Ukraine first tail off and then end. And just as the Nixon administration in the 1970s spoke about the need for to conduct what they called a Vietnamization of the war, of getting the South Vietnamese to fight the North Vietnamese and take over the burden of the war from the Americans. So I suspect that we're going to see the Trump people increasingly argue that it is the Europeans who need to bear the burden in Ukraine because the United States has other things that it needs to do. And moreover, I'm going to say that not only are we going to see the Americans insist that the Europeans take on more of the burden in Ukraine, they're also going to say that the Europeans need to take over greater responsibility for their own defense. And the Americans, of course, are already demanding that spending on defense in Europe should be increased to 3% of GDP, which I think is consistent with this. And the Europeans, for their part, are going to be left in a very difficult position. Their economies are in very poor shape. Spending is out of control. Deficits are high. Debt is very high. But they are coming under pressure from the Americans to support Ukraine and to spend more on their own defense. And on the latter, the Europeans might have another reason for being unhappy about being asked to spend more on their own defense. Because with the Americans prioritizing China, they will undoubtedly calculate that the more Europe spends on defense, the more the Americans will say, well, now that you're spending so much on defense, you don't really need us anymore, so we can withdraw even more troops from Europe than we had said before that we would, because these troops are needed in the Pacific. NATO, as was once famously said, was all about keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Well, the Germans are going down without any special need from the Russians, though a certain amount of help from the Americans. The Americans, however, are perhaps for the first time, and for their own very tough-minded, very tough reasons, starting to think that it might be time for them to go out, unraveling the whole theory that underpins NATO. Well, there we are. I am going to quickly now turn to the situation in the Middle East. Yesterday, I discussed an article that had appeared in a magazine called Duran, which I have not any deep knowledge of, but which suggested that there had been a significant cooling of relations between Syria and Iran, and even said that the Syrian intelligence agencies under Assad in 2024 have been giving tip-offs to the Israelis about which targets the Israelis should strike in Syria, because top officials from the IRGC might be found there. And, well, I'm still very cautious about accepting that particular article, but there's been some reinforcement from it, from an article which I should say I owe the knowledge of to Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism. It's appeared in another magazine called Perspectives, one which seems to have a very different ideological slant from Duran. Anyway, this appears actually to corroborate to a great extent what the article in D1 said, which is that during the last period of his time in power, the relationship between Assad and Iran had significantly cooled, and that Syria was no longer pulling its weight within the axis of resistance as it had previously done, and that the Iranians were becoming increasingly disillusioned with Assad and disappointed with him. And the article makes some, not exactly the same points as the article in D1, but it also says that the Iranians have long since largely given up using the land bridge through Syria to support Hezbollah. The road crossings had, for a long time, been very, very insecure. The airports in Aleppo and Damascus were regularly bombed by the Israelis. This article doesn't say with Syrian complicity, but of course the D1 article suggested that it was with Syrian complicity, and that as a result, Iran some time ago made alternative arrangements to keep Hezbollah supported, that most supplies now go to Iran by ship, to Lebanon, to Hezbollah by ship from Iran, that Iran operates powerful anti-ship missile batteries on the Lebanese coast, which would make it very dangerous for the Israelis to interfere with that shipping. Maybe that's true. And also that a major effort has been made by the Iranians to make both the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon effectively self-reliant, with Iran providing technology rather than the kind of military goods that Hezbollah can mass produce for itself. And the article also says, and again, I think this is probably true, that the Iranians have been gradually pulling out of Syria and that this pullout has been underway for a long time. And they point to an underground missile complex somewhere in Syria, which has been reached by HTS fighters and which has been shown. And the interesting thing about this complex is that the complex itself fell intact to the HTS fighters. There were no actual missiles found in it. All of the missiles had already been removed and presumably brought back to Iran. So there it is. This is an interesting article, and it does seem to me that it does, to some extent, support what the D1 article that I discussed yesterday actually said. And this article says that as a result of these steps that the Iranians had already taken, the actual blow Iran has received as a result of the fall of the Assad government is nothing like as heavy as many suppose. And from Iran's point of view, one of the effects of the fall of the Assad government is that it has at least lifted from Iran the heavy financial drain that supporting Syria, Assad's Syria, had become. As I said, you can find this article on Perspectives, and its title is Iran's Assad Calculus, Actual Costs of Support versus Benefits to Iran, and it appears to have been written by someone called Shivan, who, from the sound of it, is probably Iranian. I'm not in a position, as I said, to comment further about this. It would not surprise me, however, if it was true. And one further reason why it might be true is that the Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan, has now said that Israel had communicated to Turkey that they did not want the actual fall of the Assad government. In fact, I remember reading reports to this effect before Assad quit Damascus in the Times of Israel, that from Israel's point of view, a weak Assad government still in control of Damascus and central Syria was preferable to the situation that has arisen today. And of course, it's possible that Fidan is lying. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. The Turkish government, perhaps stung by allegations that the major beneficiary of Assad's fall has been Israel, wants to refute that. They want to say that really, on the contrary, they haven't done anything that helps Israel at all. The Israelis did not, in fact, want to see the outcome that we have seen. I'm not going to place excessive amount of reliance on what the Turks are saying. But anyway, put all that aside, this comment of Fidan's, the reason to think that there might be some truth to it is these two articles, the one in Duran and the one in Perspectives. Because if Assad was in fact starting to distance himself from Iran, if Syrian intelligence was giving Israel tip-offs about the positions in Syria occupied by the IRGC, which Israel could strike, well, one can imagine that in that case, there might have been some people in Israel who might have said to themselves, better a fairly stable, though enfeebled government in Damascus with which Israel maintains this kind of undercover relationship than the uncertainties of the chaos in Syria that we now see. As to the effects of that chaos, what I will further say is this. Apparently, there's been secret discussions between Israel and Jordan. The Israelis apparently are very concerned about a possible flood of weapons, especially small arms from Syria, Kalashnikovs and ammunition and that kind of thing, and man pads and anti-tank missiles and rockets and that kind of thing, pouring out of Syria, reinforcing militias in anti-Israeli militias in Lebanon, Hezbollah, but above all, that they're worried that some of these weapons could find their way into the Israeli-controlled West Bank, and that might toughen up, strengthen resistance to Israel there. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen. All I'm saying is that the Israelis are apparently worried enough about the threat of it to be talking to Jordan, which again may argue against a united decision by the Israeli authorities to support the overthrow of Assad. Well, I want to stress this is all information I don't know about, things I don't actually know about. I don't know what discussions took place in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv any more than I know about what discussions took place in Tehran and Moscow and Ankara. I can make fairly shrewd guesses about the discussions, however, that took place in Moscow, Tehran and Ankara, whereas discussions within Israel are more difficult to read and I'm going to guess that there were divisions and disagreements about it amongst the Israelis themselves. But anyway, all of this is very interesting, and it does, I think, provide further context and more explanations for the fact of Assad's fall. Anyway, I'm going to be returning to all of these topics, no doubt, in my next program tomorrow. I will also obviously return to the situation in Georgia, where the Georgian Dream Party has successfully elected a new president in place of Mrs. Zurabishvili. But this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.